In 1932, the Australian outback was a land of broken promises and desperate men. The men who survived the trenches of the First World War came home to a country that owed them everything and gave them almost nothing. The Australian government's solution was land. Soldier-settler blocks across the dry wheat regions of Western Australia. By 1932, the Great Depression had crushed wheat prices, and families were surviving on almost nothing. Then the emus arrived, 20,000 of them, moving south from their breeding grounds, hungry and unstoppable. Emus are not graceful. They are ancient, armored, and absolutely indifferent to human property. They destroyed fences, trampled crops, and drank the water supplies that struggling farms depended on. The emu does not negotiate, does not retreat, and does not care what you think of it. The desperate farmers held meetings, signed petitions, and did what Australians always do. They complained to the government. The farmers demanded military intervention, and to everyone's surprise, the government agreed. Defence Minister George Pearce, a man who had sent soldiers to real wars, saw no problem with deploying the military against birds. The 7th Heavy Battery of the Royal Australian Artillery was deployed, complete with 2 Lewis machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. The Lewis gun, a weapon designed to cut down human soldiers in the trenches of the Western Front, was being prepared for emus. Major G.P.W. Meredith was the commanding officer, a decorated soldier now tasked with defeating Australia's second-largest bird. On November 2, 1932, the Australian military rolled into the Western Australian outback to begin what they expected would be a swift, decisive campaign. The soldiers arrived to find the landscape already occupied by creatures with no understanding of what was about to happen. The first problem became immediately obvious. Emus don't stand still, and they don't group up conveniently for machine gun fire. Meredith set up his Lewis guns at a water dam, expecting the emus to gather. And initially, they did. 1,000 emus were at the dam, and before the gunners could open fire, they scattered into the bush in every direction. Instead of one target of 1,000 emus, Meredith suddenly had 1,000 targets of 1 emu each. The gunners opened fire and discovered something that military planners had not anticipated. Emus are extraordinarily hard to kill. The emu's anatomy is a fortuitous accident of evolution. Dense feathers, a small and moving target center, and legs that keep running even after being hit. Soldiers reported shooting individual emus multiple times, only to watch them shake, recover, and disappear into the bush. After the first major engagement, Meredith's men had fired 2,500 rounds and confirmed fewer than 50 emu deaths. Then the rain came, and the outback transformed from a dusty hunting ground into a mud field that stopped the vehicles cold. The trucks, carrying the Lewis guns, sank into the mud while the emus, built for exactly this terrain, walked right past them. After 6 days, the operation had killed perhaps 100 emus, used thousands of rounds, and achieved nothing measurable for the farmers. Meredith sent his first official report to command, and the word success did not appear in it. In Canberra, politicians were reading reports that were, to put it generously, not what they had expected. After less than 2 weeks, the operation was temporarily suspended. The military had withdrawn from its first encounter with the emus. The press had followed the campaign, and their headlines were not what the defense minister had hoped for. International newspapers picked up the story within days, and the mockery was immediate, global, and completely merciless. In Parliament, opposition members asked, with barely concealed delight, how many bullets it took to defeat an emu. Meredith, to his credit, retained both his sense of humor and his professional composure, publicly at least. The emus, unaware of their new international celebrity, continued destroying crops. For the farmers who had lobbied for military intervention, the retreat was not just embarrassing, it was devastating. The farmers sent a flood of angry telegrams to the government demanding that the operation resume. Political cartoonists across the country found the story irresistible, and their cartoons were not kind. Under political pressure from both directions, embarrassed by failure and pressured by desperate farmers, the government made the only decision it could. The second phase of the Emu War began on November 13th. Meredith returned to the bush with the same guns and a new tactical approach. Meredith's tactical adaptation: mount the Lewis gun on the truck and chase the emus across open ground at speed. The problem with chasing emus in a truck across the Australian outback is that the Australian outback does not have roads. The trucks, driven at speed across rock-strewn terrain, began breaking down faster than the emus were being killed. The emu had 10 million years of evolutionary adaptation to this landscape. The military had a 6-week campaign plan. At the end of each day, the soldiers compared ammunition spent to emus confirmed dead, and the ratio was never good. Ornithologists later noted what the soldiers had discovered practically. Emus have a sophisticated flock response to threat. They disperse and reassemble rather than massing and fighting. Emus are not intelligent in any human sense, but they are adaptive, and adaptation turned out to be sufficient. Every carefully planned tactical approach was met, apparently by accident, with an effective counter-response. Meredith held daily briefings, adapting his tactics in response to what the emus were doing, which is not a sentence any military commander expected to write in 1932. The emus kept appearing from the scrubland because the scrubland was enormous, and the military force was not. Meredith later described the emus as having remarkable vitality, which is military understatement for we cannot kill them efficiently. The soldiers were expending on average 10 rounds per confirmed emu kill, against a target of 20,000 birds. The Australian summer was another enemy. 40-degree heat that exhausted men, overheated guns, and bothered emus not at all. The Lewis guns began jamming, dust and heat and the rapid fire required against dispersed targets taking their toll on the mechanism. The campaign had settled into a grim routine that produced results, just not enough of them to matter. The farmers who had demanded military intervention watched the operation with growing despair. The birds were still there, the crops were still being destroyed. At the end of each day, the emus returned to the crops, because no amount of gunfire had changed the underlying mathematics of hunger and food supply. The cost per emu calculations being done in Parliament were not encouraging for anyone who had authorized the operation. The public was reading the operational statistics, and the statistics were, to put it charitably, mixed. Seen from the air, the fundamental problem of the Emu War was immediately obvious. The army had brought enough force to win a skirmish and declared war on a continent. Australia's ornithological community followed the campaign with, it must be said, considerable professional interest.
The emu can run at 50 kilometers per hour and maintain a lower sustained speed, 30+ kilometers per hour, for extraordinary distances. Ornithologists noted that emu flocks demonstrate edge detection behavior. The birds at the edge of a mob alert the center long before a human threat is close enough to act. The emu's legs are powerful enough to kick through a standard farm fence, which is why 20,000 of them destroyed so much infrastructure so quickly.
A mob of emus is not merely a bird problem. It is a biological wave that dismantles infrastructure through sheer accumulated pressure. Meredith briefed command with a statement that became legendary. If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world. That quote was not a joke. It was Meredith's professional assessment of an opponent that had genuinely impressed him. The emus kept returning to the same areas that had been engaged, because the food was there, and the memory of the guns was not there in any form that deterred them. The emus were not there for philosophical reasons. They were there because the wheat farms represented the largest concentration of food in their migration range. The farms were built across a natural emu migration corridor, a route the birds had used for thousands of years before the farms existed. The final tally of the first phase, nearly 10,000 rounds of ammunition, fewer than 1,000 confirmed emu deaths, 19,000 emus still operational. Meredith made the professional decision that is hardest for any commander: continue despite the evidence, because stopping would mean admitting total failure. Meanwhile, in Canberra, parliamentary debate about the Emu War had become increasingly heated for a topic involving birds. Senator James asked in Parliament, "Is a military division with 2 Lewis guns the appropriate response to a flock of birds?" A question for which there is no good answer. George Pearce, who had been called Minister for the Emu War by the press, was discovering that wildlife management is not a Department of Defense function. The press had moved from amusement to editorial contempt, the transition that every failed government operation eventually triggers. The farmers had developed a complicated relationship with the operation, grateful for any attempt at help, despairing at its effectiveness, and increasingly amused by its absurdity. There were days when the operation appeared to be working, and the next morning the same number of emus appeared in the same places. Emus breed prolifically, which meant that even if the campaign had been successful, the population would have recovered within years. The emus were winning not through strategy, but through the simple, irresistible logic of biological necessity meeting an inadequate response. On December 10, 1932, the government ordered the operation suspended, framing it as a successful completion rather than a withdrawal under fire. As the military convoy drove away, the emus returned, as they had returned after every engagement, as they would continue to return. Meredith's final report was the document of a man who had done his job with limited tools against an opponent his tools were not designed for. The official count, nearly 10,000 rounds, fewer than 2,500 confirmed kills, and approximately 17,500 emus still very much alive. Parliament reviewed the report and reached a consensus. The operation had achieved its limited objectives, a conclusion that required considerable creative interpretation of the actual results. The farmers, who had demanded military intervention, were left with the same problem they had started with, and significantly less faith in the government's ability to solve it. The ornithologists who were asked afterward explained patiently that emus cannot be controlled by shooting them, a piece of information that would have been useful before the campaign began. The farmers wrote letters to Parliament, and the letters were, to use the Australian vernacular, not entirely complimentary. The farmers went back to mending their own fences, literally, which is where they had been before the military arrived. Within a month of the withdrawal, the situation in the Campion district was exactly what it had been in October, before the military arrived. Biologists later identified that the solution to the emu problem was not bullets, it was better fencing, managed water points, and working with the migration rather than against it. The government eventually funded better fencing, which cost a fraction of the military operation and was considerably more effective. Meredith's quote about the emu's military qualities became the most quoted line from the entire campaign, and it was entirely sincere. Major Meredith went on to a respectable military career. The Emu War was the chapter he preferred not to open at dinner parties. In 1934, the farmers requested military assistance again, and were refused, this time with a speed that suggested at least some institutional learning had occurred. The total cost of the military operation exceeded the cost of the fencing solution by a factor that historians have described as instructive. Western Australia's wheat farmers and its emus have been in ongoing negotiation for 90 years since the Great Emu War, and both sides are still there. The emu is on Australia's coat of arms, a national symbol chosen, in part, because it cannot walk backward, representing progress. It is also, as of 1932, an undefeated military opponent. The complete records of the Emu War were preserved in the Australian National Archives, a decision that history has vindicated through 90 years of people finding them irresistible. The landscape of the Great Emu War still looks much the same: red soil, sparse scrub, and somewhere in the middle distance, emus. The Great Emu War is now taught in military strategy courses as a case study in the mismatch between available force and the nature of the problem. The Emu War is the cleanest possible illustration of what happens when institutional confidence outpaces situational understanding. Australian museums have embraced the Emu War as a story that contains something essential about the national character. Specifically, the willingness to try things that obviously won't work and then be funny about the results. Australian children learn about the Emu War in school, and their reaction, universally, is the same as yours when you first heard it. The emus, of course, have no knowledge of any of this, and would not care if they did. The emu has been in Australia for more than 50 million years. The Lewis gun was invented in 1911. The contest was perhaps not as even as the planners assumed. Australia is a continent that has been humbling human plans for as long as humans have been making plans in it. Documentaries, books, and articles about the Great Emu War continue to be produced, because the story never gets less funny or less instructive. The institutional lesson of the Emu War, match the response to the actual nature of the problem, is one that every military generation has to learn independently. The Western Australian wheat industry that the soldiers fought, in their way, to protect still exists and still produces. The soldier settlers who had survived the Western Front now had to survive the emus, and most of them managed both, which says something about human resilience. The emus are still migrating, the same routes, the same rhythms, the same agricultural areas, the same indifference to human infrastructure. Every historian who encounters the Emu War for the first time has the same reaction. Disbelief, followed by certainty that this is the story they need to tell everyone they know. Major Meredith served Australia through 2 world wars and a distinguished military career. The Emu War was one chapter, and not his finest. On the Australian coat of arms, the emu stands proud, an animal chosen for its symbolic inability to reverse, representing national progress. The symbolism, after 1932, acquired additional layers. The Great Emu War ended in 1932. The emus did not notice. Today, wildlife biologists manage human-emu conflict with data and ecological understanding, the approach that works, and that didn't require 10,000 rounds of ammunition. The Campion district today is quiet. The wheat farm still operating, the emu still present. The conflict managed by fences rather than Lewis guns. Look at this face. This is the face of the only unambiguous victor of the Great Emu War, an animal that won simply by continuing to be an emu. The Great Emu War cost 10,000 rounds of ammunition, defeated a modern military, and taught Australia something about the limits of institutional force against biological reality. So the question is, what does your government's most recent overconfident decision have in common with the Great Emu War of 1932? Tell us in the comments.